It arrived without warning, tucked into the middle of an ordinary evening that had given me no reason to be on guard. I was standing in a grocery store checkout line, half thinking about dinner and half thinking about nothing at all, when my phone vibrated. The family group chat was usually a place of routine messages, reminders, and casual updates, so I opened it without hesitation. What I read did not come with raised voices or dramatic confrontation. It did not announce itself as a moment that would divide my life into before and after. It was a single sentence, cold and deliberate, followed by a small emoji that somehow made it worse. I was not invited to my own mother's birthday, and the message ended with a word meant to diminish me, to reduce my existence to something laughable and disposable. Before I could even process what it meant, my mother reacted to the message with a heart. That small symbol landed heavier than the insult itself. It was not confusion or concern. It was agreement. The world around me continued as if nothing had happened. The cashier scanned items. A child cried somewhere behind me. Someone laughed near the entrance. The normal rhythm of life made the moment feel surreal, as though the fracture I had just felt existed only inside my chest. There was no follow-up message, no explanation, no attempt to soften the cruelty. The silence that followed spoke louder than anything else. It was the silence of people who had already made a decision and saw no reason to explain it to the one being excluded. In that stillness, I understood that this was not about a party. It was about belonging, and the realization that I no longer did. I left the store without buying anything, not because I was overwhelmed with emotion, but because something fundamental had shifted. I was not being asked to stay away for convenience or logistics. I was being removed. The message was not a mistake or a joke that went too far. It was a declaration, delivered casually, as if my absence required no justification. What hurt most was not the cruelty of my sister's words, but the ease with which my mother affirmed them. That single reaction erased years of effort, care, and loyalty in a heartbeat. As the night settled in, memories surfaced uninvited. I thought about the countless times I had shown up without being asked, the roles I had filled quietly, the ways I had supported and stabilized without ever demanding recognition. None of it had protected me. None of it had earned me a conversation, let alone respect. The message made something painfully clear. My presence had been tolerated because of what I provided, not valued for who I was. The next day, the group chat resumed its normal pace, as if the exclusion had never happened. Plans were made, instructions were given, and enthusiasm flowed freely among everyone else. No one acknowledged the message from the night before. No one questioned why I was suddenly absent. It was as if I had been edited out of a story that continued without pause. Watching it unfold, I realized that my erasure had not been impulsive. It had been rehearsed over time, reinforced by every moment my needs were ignored and my contributions were assumed. That message was not loud. It did not come with confrontation or explanation. It was quiet, efficient, and final, in a few typed words and a single reaction. My role in the family was rewritten without my consent. I was no longer someone who belonged by default. I was someone whose absence was acceptable, even preferable. The realization did not break me. It clarified everything. What had felt like confusion for years finally resolved into truth. The message did not just exclude me from an event. It revealed that I had already been excluded from the family long before anyone bothered to say it out loud. The realization did not arrive all at once. It did not announce itself with anger or heartbreak. Instead, it settled slowly, like dust collecting on furniture you pass every day without noticing until the light hits it just right. I had spent years believing that what I was doing was normal, that being dependable was simply part of loving a family. I told myself that stepping in was what adults did for one another. That responsibility meant saying yes, even when it was inconvenient. It was only when I stopped to look at the pattern, instead of the individual moments, that the truth became impossible to ignore. I began to notice how often money left my hands without a conversation. Groceries were bought with the assumption that reimbursement would come later. Bills were covered quickly because it was easier than waiting for someone else to act. Deposits, reservations, and unexpected expenses all found their way to me, not through requests, but through silence. The absence of discussion was the clearest indicator. No one asked if I could afford it. No one checked if it was fair. They simply moved forward, confident that I would absorb the cost. At the time, I interpreted that confidence as trust. In reality, it was entitlement shaped by repetition. The language used around me reinforced the role I had slipped into. I was praised for being responsible, reliable, and good with money. These words sounded like compliments, but they always came with an expectation attached. Being responsible meant paying when others hesitated. Being reliable meant never saying no. Being good with money meant my resources were treated as communal property. Meanwhile, I was rarely spoken to as a daughter whose feelings mattered or a sister whose time and energy were limited. My value was measured in how smoothly things ran when I was involved. I thought back to holidays and gatherings I had organized without ever being asked if I wanted to. I remembered carrying bags, coordinating schedules, covering costs, and solving problems before anyone else noticed they existed. I remembered how effortlessly my efforts were overlooked once the event succeeded, as though the outcome had occurred on its own. When things went well, it was expected. When something went wrong, it was quietly redirected toward me to fix. This was not care. It was dependence disguised as family harmony. What made the realization heavier was understanding how little space there had been for my own needs. When I was tired, it was brushed off as stress. When I hesitated, I was reminded of how much others were dealing with. There was always a reason why my discomfort should wait. Over time, I stopped bringing it up altogether. I learned that being the provider required silence. It required swallowing resentment and convincing myself that this was simply how families functioned. The moment I truly understood the difference between being a daughter and being a provider came when I imagined what would happen if I stopped. Not in anger, not as punishment, but simply as an experiment in reality. I realized that there was no plan without me. No backup, no shared responsibility. My presence was not emotional. It was structural. I was the beam holding things up, not someone being held. That understanding changed how I saw the past. It explained why my absence was treated as an inconvenience rather than a loss. It explained why my exclusion could be announced so casually. A provider is useful until they are not. A daughter is valued regardless of what she gives. I had been living under the illusion that generosity would translate into belonging. Instead, it had defined my place as transactional. Recognizing this did not make me bitter. It made me honest. I was not failing as a daughter. I had never been allowed to be one. I had been assigned a role that served everyone else while slowly erasing me. The realization was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, grounding, and irreversible. Once I saw the truth, I could no longer unsee it. When I finally stopped paying, nothing exploded the way I had once imagined it might. There was no immediate confrontation, no dramatic phone calls, no sudden flood of angry messages demanding explanations. Instead, there was a quiet pause, a subtle hesitation in the system that had been running smoothly for years without anyone questioning who kept it moving. That pause was the first sign that my absence had weight, even if no one wanted to acknowledge it yet. At first, life in the family group chat continued as usual. Plans were discussed with the same casual confidence, details arranged with the assumption that everything would fall into place, as it always had. What changed was invisible to them, but very real to me. I was no longer the silent confirmation behind the scenes, no longer the one clicking approve, transferring funds, or smoothing over gaps before they became noticeable. I did not announce my decision or frame it as a boundary. I simply stopped participating in a role I had never agreed to hold. The practical consequences appeared slowly. Invoices arrived without being settled. Deadlines passed without action. Reminders were sent and then resent. Still unanswered, the people who had once relied on the quiet certainty of my involvement began to encounter small inconveniences they were not prepared for. A reservation went unconfirmed. An order was placed on hold. What had always been effortless now required attention, and that attention felt uncomfortable to them. As these disruptions accumulated, the emotional shift followed. Confusion surfaced first, then irritation. Questions began to circulate, not about why I had stopped paying, but about why things were no longer working. The absence of accountability was telling. They did not ask if something had changed for me or if I needed support. They focused on the inconvenience of the situation, on the disruption to their plans. My silence was interpreted not as a boundary, but as a malfunction. What struck me most was how quickly the tone changed once consequences became unavoidable. The unspoken expectation that I would fix everything gave way to subtle blame. Responsibility was redirected outward, toward staff, service providers, or vague misunderstandings. No one wanted to confront the truth that the structure they depended on had always rested on one person. Admitting that would have required acknowledging how much had been taken for granted. From my side, the experience was unexpectedly calm. I felt no rush of guilt, no need to defend myself. I watched the situation unfold with clarity rather than anxiety. For the first time, I was not racing ahead to prevent discomfort for others. I was allowing reality to exist without interference. It was not an act of punishment. It was an act of honesty. The most revealing part came when the silence shifted, when the questions stopped being abstract and became direct. I still did not step in, not because I wanted to prove a point, but because stepping in would have restored the very pattern I was trying to leave. I understood then that my role had never been appreciated because it had never been visible. Only its absence could reveal it. When I stopped paying, I learned how much of the family's stability had been outsourced to me without discussion. I learned how quickly people adapt to generosity and how uncomfortable they become when it ends. I also learned that stopping did not make me selfish or cruel. Despite the stories others told themselves, it made me present in my own life for the first time in years. Nothing dramatic happened in my world. My days grew quieter, lighter. The constant low-level tension of anticipating needs that were not my own disappeared. Meanwhile, their world was forced to adjust, not because I owed them anything, but because they had built a system that required my silence to function. When I finally stopped paying, the truth emerged gently but unmistakably. I had not broken anything. I had simply stepped away from carrying what was never meant to be mine alone. The shift from private exclusion to public blame happened quickly and without warning. One moment, the silence belonged to me, a deliberate choice to step back and allow events to unfold without my intervention. The next, my absence had been repackaged into a story meant for public consumption. It appeared not in direct messages or difficult conversations, but in carefully worded posts designed to guide sympathy in a specific direction. The truth had not changed, but the narrative had, and it was being shaped without me. The posts were vague enough to avoid accountability, yet precise enough to assign fault. Words like abandonment, responsibility, and heartbreak were used generously, while details were intentionally omitted. There were no explanations of who had managed things before or how the arrangements had been made. There was only the suggestion that someone had failed, that love had been withdrawn without cause. In the absence of facts, people filled the gaps with assumptions that felt familiar and comfortable to them. Sympathy flowed easily toward the version of the story that required the least questioning. What struck me was not the cruelty of it, but the confidence. They spoke as though the lie would hold simply because it was spoken loudly enough. They relied on my silence the way they always had, assuming I would not contradict them, would not explain myself, would not disrupt the image they were presenting. Silence had once protected the family's harmony. Now, it was being used as evidence against me. The irony was not lost on me. Friends of friends, distant relatives, and acquaintances responded with concern and encouragement, praising strength they believed they were witnessing. They could not see the manipulation because it was subtle and wrapped in the language of hurt. No one thought to ask why a celebration had depended entirely on someone who had been told they were not welcome. No one questioned why responsibility and affection seemed to flow in only one direction. The lie did not need to be elaborate. It only needed to be plausible. I watched the performance unfold without intervening, not because I was powerless, but because I understood something important. Correcting the narrative would not have corrected the dynamic. Defending myself publicly would have dragged me back into a system that thrived on my emotional labor. Every explanation would have been dissected, challenged, or reframed. Truth offered in hostile spaces rarely lands as truth. It becomes material for further distortion. As time passed, the cracks began to show on their own. The story required consistency, and reality is difficult to suppress indefinitely. People noticed contradictions. They wondered why arrangements had fallen apart so completely. They questioned how a single absence could cause such widespread collapse. The lie began to strain under the weight of its own omissions. It could not account for the logistics, the finances, the responsibilities that had always existed quietly in the background. The collapse did not happen through confrontation. It happened through observation. People saw what was missing, and they drew their own conclusions. Some said nothing at all. Others shifted their tone, less certain, less willing to repeat what they had initially accepted. The confidence of the public blame softened as it became clear that the story was incomplete. Silence, once weaponized against me, began to work in my favor. Through it all, I remained still. I did not counterattack or expose details. I did not seek validation or vindication. I allowed the truth to exist without forcing it into view. There was a strange peace in that choice. I was no longer performing, no longer trying to manage how others perceived me. The lie needed energy to survive, and I was no longer supplying it. In the end, the collapse was quiet. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing. The narrative simply lost momentum. Posts stopped appearing. Sympathy moved on to something else. What remained was a subtle but lasting shift in how people saw the situation. The lie had done its damage, but it had also revealed something essential. A story built on omission cannot stand forever. When silence is no longer used to protect it, the truth does not need to shout. It only needs time. Choosing distance was not an impulsive act fueled by anger or resentment. It was a measured response to clarity. Once I understood the pattern I had been living inside, stepping back became less about punishment and more about preservation. Distance was not created to hurt anyone. It was created to stop the quiet erosion of my sense of self that had been happening for years under the weight of unspoken expectations. Boundaries did not arrive as declarations or ultimatums. They formed through absence. I stopped responding to messages that assumed access to my time, money, or emotional labor. I removed myself from spaces where my presence was taken for granted, but my voice was disregarded. Each small withdrawal felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, because I had been conditioned to believe that availability equaled love. Yet with every boundary I held, something steadier replaced the discomfort. I began to recognize the difference between being kind and being consumed. What surprised me most was how quickly resistance appeared once I stopped complying. Distance was interpreted as hostility. Silence was framed as cruelty. The same people who had dismissed my needs suddenly accused me of being cold or distant. It became clear that what they missed was not me, but what I provided. Boundaries exposed that distinction without a single argument. When access ended, so did the illusion of mutual care. Self-respect, I learned, is not loud. It does not require validation or agreement. It exists quietly in the choices we make when no one is applauding. I stopped explaining myself because explanation had always been used as an invitation for negotiation. I stopped justifying my decisions because they were no longer up for debate. For the first time, I allowed my no to exist without decoration or apology. Distance created space, and in that space, I began to feel the weight I had been carrying lift. My thoughts were no longer occupied with anticipating demands or preventing disappointment. My finances stabilized. My time became my own. Even my body responded. Tension easing in places I had not realized were constantly braced. The relief was not dramatic, but it was persistent, like finally setting down something heavy after holding it for too long. There were moments of doubt. Years of conditioning do not dissolve overnight. I questioned whether I was being unfair, whether I was abandoning people I was supposed to love. But each time I examined those thoughts honestly, I noticed they were rooted in obligation rather than connection. Love that requires self-erasure is not love. It is control softened by familiarity. Choosing distance also meant grieving the version of family I had hoped for. I had to let go of the idea that clearer communication or greater effort on my part would eventually lead to mutual respect. Accepting that reality was painful, but it was also freeing. I stopped chasing an outcome that had never been within my control. Over time, boundaries stopped feeling like walls and began to feel like structure. They did not isolate me. They defined where I ended and where others began. In honoring them, I did not become harder. I became more honest. I learned that self-respect is not about being valued by others. It is about valuing myself enough to walk away from dynamics that demanded I shrink. Distance did not solve everything, but it changed everything that mattered. It allowed me to exist without constant justification. It returned my energy to me. In choosing boundaries and self-respect, I did not lose my family. I lost a version of myself that believed endurance was the same as love. Walking away did not feel like a dramatic exit or a final confrontation. It felt quiet, almost anticlimactic, as if the noise that had filled my life for years simply faded into the background. There was no moment where I slammed doors or delivered final words meant to echo. Instead, I stepped away gradually, deliberately, choosing calm over chaos and clarity over conflict. Peace did not rush in immediately, but it waited patiently for me to make room for it. At first, walking away felt unfamiliar. My days had been shaped for so long by anticipating needs that were not my own that the absence of those demands left an open space I did not know how to fill. I noticed how often I reached for my phone out of habit, expecting a request or a problem to solve. Each time there was nothing, I felt a small release, followed by a quiet sadness. Letting go of responsibility also meant letting go of the identity I had built around being needed. As time passed, that sadness softened into something steadier. I began to notice how peaceful my mornings were without the weight of obligation waiting for me. I made decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would keep others comfortable. Simple choices, like how to spend an evening or where to put my energy, felt restorative instead of draining. I realized how much of my life had been spent managing tension that did not belong to me. Reclaiming my life was not about replacing one structure with another. It was about allowing space for authenticity. I stopped explaining my absence and stopped justifying my choices. The need to be understood by those who had never tried to understand me dissolved slowly. In its place grew a quiet confidence that I did not owe anyone access to my time, my resources, or my peace. There were moments when memories resurfaced, pulling at old emotions. Guilt would flicker, fueled by years of conditioning that told me loyalty meant endurance. But each time, I returned to the truth of how I felt now compared to before. The calm I experienced was not numbness. It was relief. It was the absence of constant vigilance, the freedom of no longer bracing for disappointment or dismissal. As I settled into this new rhythm, I discovered parts of myself that had been overshadowed by responsibility. I read more. I walked without an agenda. I invested in friendships that felt reciprocal and nourishing. These connections did not demand explanations or sacrifices. They existed naturally, built on presence rather than obligation. Through them, I learned that support does not have to feel heavy to be real. Peace did not mean that everything was resolved or forgiven. It meant I accepted what I could not change and stopped trying to fix what was never mine to repair. Walking away allowed me to grieve the relationships I had hoped for without reopening wounds. It gave me the dignity of choosing myself without needing permission. Reclaiming my life also meant redefining success. It was no longer measured by how much I could carry or how many problems I could solve. It was measured by how present I felt in my own body and how aligned my choices were with my values. The quiet moments became meaningful. The absence of drama became a gift. Walking away was not an ending. It was a return. I returned to myself, to my needs, to a version of life that felt sustainable and kind. Peace was not something I found by fighting harder or explaining more. It arrived when I finally stopped asking others to see my worth and allowed myself to live as though it had always been there.